Hello all, welcome again to my channel English Literature for Competitive Exams. Today we will be talking about Emily Elizabeth Dickinson, a 19th century American poet. Please watch the video till the end. This video is also available in Hindi and you can find the link in my description box. So let's get started. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born on December 10, 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, United States. She died on May 15, 1886 in Amherst, Massachusetts, United States. Critic Harold Bloom has placed Emily Dickinson alongside Walt Whitman, Wallace Stevens, Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, and Hart Crane as a major American poet. She was a 19th century American poet who lived much of her life in isolation. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born to Edward Dickinson and Emily Norcross Dickinson. Her father, Edward Dickinson, was a lawyer in Amherst and a trustee of Amherst College. Emily characterized her mother, Emily Norcross Dickinson, as being cold and unloving. After her mother died in 1882, Dickinson summed up the relationship in a confidential letter to her Norcross cousins. "We were never intimate mother and children while she was our mother, but when she became a child, the affection came." Edward Dickinson and Emily Norcross had three children: William Austen, known as Austen, Aust, or Aw; Emily Elizabeth; Lavinia Norcross, known as Lavinia or Winnie. Emily Dickinson's parental grandfather, Samuel Dickinson, was one of the founders of Amherst College. Dickinson attended the Amherst Academy for 7 years before enrolling at the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. Emily Dickinson's education was ambitiously classical for a Victorian girl. Dickinson stayed at the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in 1847 to 1848 only for 10 months before quitting. She studied classical literature, English, botany, Latin, geology, history, philosophy, and arithmetic. Emily Dickinson studied botany as a child and meticulously tended the homestead garden. Scholar Judith Farr notes that Emily Dickinson was well known in her town for her exceptional gardening abilities, far more than for her writing abilities. Emily Dickinson's younger sister, Lavinia, discovered 1,800 of her poems in her bedroom after her death. Only 10 of her 1,800 poems have titles. The rest of her poetry was given titles based on the first lines of the poems or by posthumous editors. While she was alive, only 10 of her poems and one letter were published in newspapers and journals between 1850 and 1878. Her poems were all published anonymously during her lifetime, and they may have been published without her knowledge. From 1858 to 1865, in handmade booklets, now called fascicles, she created 40 fascicles containing nearly 800 poems, which she kept extremely private and shared with no one. The most prolific writing years for Emily Dickinson were between 1861 and 1865. By the age of 35, Dickinson had written over 1,100 incisive lyrics about suffering, joy, love, nature, and the arts. Dickinson is best known for her eccentric personality, and many of her poems deal with the themes of death and mortality. Many of her poems deal with the macabre subject of death, whether by starvation, crucifixion, shooting, drowning, or suffocation. One aspect of death that piqued Dickinson's interest in her writing was "I felt funeral in the brain," which referred to a disinterest in living that she felt resulted in the death of the self. Let's talk about three distinct periods of Dickinson's poems. Dickinson's poems are generally divided into three periods: pre-1861, 1861 to 1865, post-1866. Pre-1861. Prior to 1858, the poems are typically conventional and sentimental in nature. Only 5 of Emily Dickinson's poems were written before 1858, according to Thomas H. Johnson, who later published the poems of Emily Dickinson. Two are mock valentines done in an ornate and humorous style. Two others are traditional lyrics, one of which is about missing her brother Austin. And the fifth poem, which begins, I have a bird in spring, expresses her grief over the feared loss of friendship and was sent to her friend Sue Gilbert. Dickinson began collecting her poems in small hands on books called fascicles in 1858. 1861 to 1865 period of Dickinson's poems. Her most creative period and her poetic output increased dramatically during this time. Johnson estimated that she wrote 35 poems in 1860, 86 poems in 1861, 366 in 1862, 141 in 1863, 174 in 1864. Dickinson fully developed her themes about nature, life, and mortality during this time period. Post 1866, only one third of Dickinson's poems were written in her final 20 years, when her poetic output slowed significantly. During this time, she stopped collecting her poems in fascicles. In 1864 and 1865, Dickinson was treated for painful eye conditions by Henry W. Williams, an ophthalmologist in Boston. The condition is today understood to be iritis. Dickinson's friend and mentor, Benjamin Franklin Newton, introduced her to the works of William Wordsworth and Ralph Waldo Emerson, which influenced and inspired her poetry. The works of William Shakespeare and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre were her most formative influences. Dickinson was a huge fan of the novel Jane Eyre. She even named her dog Carlo after the character St. John River's dog. Unsurprisingly, Dickinson loved William Shakespeare's writing a lot. Dickinson once said in a letter, "Why grasp any hand but this?" in reference to Shakespeare. Emily Dickinson's writing is frequently addressed and dedicated to Sue or Susie. Susan Huntington Gilbert, whom Emily met at Amherst, became a close friend and object of Dickinson's affection. Dickinson did, however, enjoy sharing her poems with those close to her. Susan, one of her closest friends, received 250 of her poems. At least 11 of Dickinson's poems were dedicated to her sister-in-law Susan Gilbert. In a letter to her sister-in-law Susan Gilbert, Emily Dickinson said, "With the exception of Shakespeare, you have told me of more knowledge than any one living. To say that sincerely is strange praise." Emily and Susan's relationship is depicted in the film Wild Nights with Emily and explored in the television series Dickinson. I Have a Bird in Spring was written for Sue Gilbert and was a lament about the grief of fearing the loss of friendship after Sue married Dickinson's brother Austin. In 1855, she met Charles Wadsworth, a famous minister of the Arch Street Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, with whom she formed a strong friendship that lasted until his death in 1882. Despite only seeing him twice after 1855, he moved to San Francisco in 1862. She referred to him variously as "my Philadelphia," "my dearest earthly friend," "my clergyman," and "my shepherd from little girlhood." Dickinson met Otis Phillips Lord, an elderly judge on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court from Salem, in 1872 or 1873. She started a relationship with Judge Otis Lord, a widowed friend of her father. Lord proposed to the poet in 1883, but probably either Dickinson rejected his proposal or didn't give an answer. After being critically ill for several years, Judge Lord died in March 1884. Dickinson referred to him as "our latest lost" and "my lovely Salem." Thomas Wentworth Higginson served as a literary mentor to Emily Dickinson and also Atlantic Monthly's editor. When he published an article in 1862 urging aspiring authors to submit their work, It marked the beginning of his friendship with Dickinson. Her four poems made such an impression on Higginson that they started a correspondence that lasted until Dickinson's passing. By the end of this correspondence, Dickinson began to use "dear friend" instead of Higginson name in the letters to him. Brenda Wineapple's acclaimed nonfiction book, White Heat, describes the close friendship between Dickinson and Higginson. Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Mabel Loomis Todd, Dickinson's brother Austen's mistress, published her first collection of poetry in 1890, though both heavily edited the content. In 1998 article in the New York Times revealed that of the many edits made to Dickinson's work, the name Susan was often deliberately removed. When scholar Thomas H. Johnson published The Poems of Emily Dickinson in 1955, it was the first time a complete and mostly unaltered collection of her poetry was available. The first poem published, Nobody Knows This Little Rose, may have actually been published without Dickinson's permission. Another poem, Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers, was retitled and published as The Sleeping. Between 1858 and 1862, Dickinson wrote a trio of letters that became known as the Master Letters. Addressed to an unknown man, she only refers to as Master, Sir, and Signor. They may not have been intended for a real person at all. They remain one of Dickinson's life's major mysteries. Although Emily Dickinson never refers to the Civil War by name in her poems, many of them, like It Feels a Shame to Be Alive, can be seen as alluding to the nation's political atmosphere. She wrote nearly 900 poems during the Civil War. Dickinson made a rare public appearance when she anonymously sent 3 poems to the drum beat in an effort to support the Union cause. Dickinson developed her unique style of unconventional punctuation, capitalization, and line breaks, insisting that they were essential to the meaning of the poems. She often used ballad stanza forms and ABCB rhyme schemes. Her stanza and rhyme structure were most likely influenced by the Protestant hymn writer Isaac Watts. Andrew Lang dismissed Dickinson's work, stating that if poetry is to exist at all, it really must have form and grammar, and must rhyme when it professes to rhyme. Dickinson challenged religious and social conventions. Despite attending church on a regular basis until her 30s, she identified as a pagan and wrote about the superiority of science over religion. After she stopped going to church around 1852, she wrote a poem that began, Some keep the Sabbath going to church, I keep it staying at home. Dickinson never married and had no children. Dickinson's reclusive tendencies became increasingly extreme around 1867. She began refusing to see visitors, only speaking to them through closed doors, and rarely went out in public. When she did leave the house, she always wore white, earning her the nickname the Woman in White. Despite her aversion to physical socialization, Dickinson was an active correspondent who preferred to communicate with most of her friends through letters rather than face to face. Dickinson became even more reclusive during the 1880s. After the death of her mother, nephew Gilbert, and friends Charles Wadsworth, Judge Otis P. Lord, and Helen Hunt Jackson. Dickinson's health started deteriorating in 1885 and she died on May 15, 1886. Bright's disease, a kidney disease, was declared the cause of death by her doctor. Scholars and historians have debated whether this was the true cause of her death. One widely held belief is that Dickinson died as a result of high blood pressure. Susan Gilbert was tasked with preparing her body for burial and writing her obituary, which she did meticulously. Emily Dickinson's final letter was to her cousins, Louise and Frances Norcross, which simply read, "Little cousins called back Emily." Martha Dickinson Bianchi, her niece, later gave her dead aunt a new headstone carved with the poet's name, birth and death dates, and the words "called back," a reference to Hugh Conway's 1880 novel of the same name, which Dickinson enjoyed reading. Joyce Carol Oates, an omnidisciplinary writer, referred to Dickinson as the poet of paradox. Thomas Wentworth Higginson is best known for discouraging Emily Dickinson from publishing during her lifetime and butchering her poetry after her death. He called her "my partially cracked poetess." Samuel Bowles addressed her as Queen Recluse. People in the town referred to her as Myth of Emerest due to her isolated, mysterious existence. Another nickname given to her was Belle of Emerest or the Nun of Emerest, presumably because she was a spinster who had never married. Harold Bloom listed Emily Dickinson among the 26 central writers of Western civilization. Helen Hunt Jackson managed to convince Dickinson to publish her poem "Success is Counted Sweetest" anonymously in a volume called A Masque of Poets. Emily Dickinson's biographer, Alfred Heberger, wrote the book "My Wars Are Laid Away in Books: The Life of Emily Dickinson." George Witcher wrote the book "This Was a Poet: A Critical Biography of Emily Dickinson." Adrian Rich wrote the book "Vesuvius at Home: The Power of Emily Dickinson." E. A. Sargent named Emily Dickinson as one of the rarest flowers the stunner New England ever bore. Today, Emily Dickinson is widely acknowledged as an innovative proto-modernist poet. Emily Dickinson said, "Tuesday is a deeply depressed day. Winter is a season of death and a metaphor for death in Emily Dickinson's poetry." Emily Dickinson's poetry has been translated into languages including French, Spanish, Mandarin, Chinese, Persian, Kurdish, Georgian, Swedish, and Russian. Her poetry collection, Mabel Loomis Todd and T. W. Higginson, edited the first volume of Dickinson's poems, which appeared in November 1890. The first volume contained 115 poems. Poems' second series was published in 1891 with 5 editions by 1893. The third series was published in 1896. Famous publications in Dickinson's lifetime: 1850, Magnum Bonum Harum Scarum letter. Dickinson addresses a possible real-life suitor in this letter, George H. Gould, a close friend of her brother Austin. 1852, Sic Transit Gloria Mundi, titled A Valentine. 1858, Nobody Knows This Little Rose, titled To Mrs. with a Rose. 1861, I Taste a Liquor Never Brewed, titled The May Wine. 1862, Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers, titled The Sleeping. 1864, Blazing in Gold and Quenching in Purple, titled Sunset. Flowers Well, If Anybody, titled Flowers. These Are the Days When Birds Come Back, titled October. Some Keep the Sabbath Going to Church, titled My Sabbath. Success is Counted Sweetest, first published in Brooklyn Daily Union, April 27, untitled. A Narrow Fellow in the Grass, titled The Snake. Some important poems by Emily Elizabeth Dickinson. Success is Counted Sweetest, 1859. I Am Nobody, Who Are You, 1861. Hope is the Thing with Feathers, 1861. I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, 1861. There's a Certain Slant of Light, 1861. Wild Nights, 1861. This is my letter to the world, 1862. I dwell in possibility, 1862. I heard a fly buzz when I died, 1862. It was not death, for I stood up, 1862. Before I got my eye put out, 1862. After great pain, a formal feeling comes, 1862. Because I could not stop for death, 1863. My life has stood a loaded gun, 1862 to 1864. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant, 1868. Notable quote by Emily Elizabeth Dickinson. If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can ever warm me. I know that is poetry. With that, we have come to an end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please like and share the video and subscribe to the channel for our more upcoming videos. Thank you so much and all the best for your exams.